So thanks for being here, everybody. I'm Fischer. A little bit about my audio background. My dad was in bands when I was a kid and had some recording equipment, and I got real kind of interested in it when I was young and started recording my first bands when I was 11, 12 years old. I studied music in college, guitar and oud performance. And then I just got really fascinated in recording all throughout college and post-college, ran a studio with some friends, moved up to Portland, started my own studio. I specialize in older technology, so I currently have 4 tape machines in my studio, 8-track, quarter-inch tape machine, couple stereo quarter-inch tape machines, and a 16-track 1-inch tape machine. And then I'm also a record lathe engineer, so I make small batch lathe cut records for local bands and national artists. I've been here at Rolling Hills for just almost a year and a half. I love mixing and making music, and I think it's a real special gift that we all have to have that sort of ear for making music and making it sound good. So I'm going to talk about the source, microphones, and that's kind of the most important thing in live sound or studio recording. So let's get going. We're going to talk about the different microphone types and their polar patterns. What are the basic types of the microphones? What are their polar patterns? And what are their applications? So first off, we have dynamic microphones. So the way that these microphones work is a small diaphragm is attached to a single coil inside the microphone, and inside that coil is a magnet. So when the diaphragm vibrates in response to a sound wave, the coil moves back and forth across the magnet, and that creates an electrical charge. That charge gets sent down the cable to the speaker, and then the speaker reverses that and then outputs the signal that the diaphragm is receiving. Chris mentioned this. They act like speakers in reverse, so you can actually use a speaker as a microphone. I heard you say the original kick drum mic. So that was one thing that was developed where, some engineers figured out, okay, if we put like a big speaker in front of the kick drum, it has that low end response, and it sounds really cool. So there's actually microphones that you can buy now that are mounted in a drum shell, and they're just a speaker in reverse, and they're called the sub kick or something. So that's a pretty cool technique. So dynamic microphones are going to be the least sensitive type of microphone. Makes them really good at recording loud sounds. So we're thinking like snare drum or guitar amp or brass instruments even. Like anything that's going to produce like a really loud sound, dynamic mics are going to be the best for recording or live application for that. They're also really good for vocals, both live and in the studio. They're one of the most produced microphones, and so there's a lot of variety in the types of dynamic microphones that you can get. So they're versatile microphones. They have low sensitivity, which makes them less prone to feedback on stage. So you can get a lot of gain, a lot of headroom on dynamic microphones before you start to hear any sort of feedback happening. I personally really like dynamic microphones. When I'm recording vocalists in the studio, like I'll always pop a dynamic microphone next to the large diaphragm condenser or ribbon mic, just to kind of blend it in with the sound. So let's move to condenser microphones now. So how does a condenser microphone work? The diaphragm is similar to a dynamic microphone. However, most of them are plated in gold, and then next to the diaphragm is an electrically charged plate. Together, those form what's called a capacitor. The sound waves cause the diaphragm to vibrate. The vibration makes it move back and forth against the stationary plate, and this creates an electrical charge called capacitance. The charge enters some sort of circuitry in the microphone or outside of the microphone, depending on what type of condenser microphone you're using, before leaving as an audio signal through the cable. A lot of these microphones need an external power source. Back in the day, they used to have battery-powered condenser microphones, or really back in the day, they had external power units. You can still get high-end studio microphones that have the external power unit, but most of the time, you're going to be sending power to these microphones through your audio interface as 48 volt or what's called phantom power. They're super ideal for the home recording studio. You can find a lot of really affordable condenser microphones that sound really great. They're way more responsive to sound pressure and sound waves because the diaphragms are just a lot more delicate, and that makes them good for picking up real precise sounds. Think of like if you have condenser microphones set up in the room, you're going to actually hear a lot more of the acoustics of the room versus a dynamic microphone that's like picking up the source directly. They're really good at picking up like across the frequency range with like kind of subtle transients, you know, the source of the sound. So they're ideal for vocals, acoustic guitar, any instrument with like detail in the high end. They kind of have this like crispiness sound to them, lots of air and transparency. And then there's two subgroups of condenser microphones, large diaphragm condenser mics and small diaphragm condenser microphones, also known as pencil condensers. And they kind of have a few different applications. The large diaphragm condensers, they give vocals a really full sound and add some subtle warmth and sparkle to the voice. They're really popular for lots of acoustic instruments, you know, acoustic guitar and like an upright piano. Your large diaphragm condensers are going to pick up those kind of subtle high-end frequencies that happen with natural strings. Because of the larger diaphragm, there's more detail that can be picked up from the sound source. They're highly sensitive and work well on quiet sound sources. They're also more fragile because of the diaphragm and quite a bit more expensive than dynamic mics, depending on what type of microphone you're getting. They can also have multiple polar patterns built in to the microphones. Most of the large diaphragm condenser mics are going to be a cardioid polar pattern, and I'll go over polar patterns in a little bit. But some allow you to switch between polar patterns. For example, the Neumann U87 can switch between omni, cardioid, and figure eight. The AKG C414, which are the two mics that are above the drum set over there, those can switch between cardioid, figure eight, hypercardioid, omnidirectional, and wide cardioid. So they're pretty expensive microphones, but you're buying like 5 microphones in one microphone is the way I look at it. Super versatile microphones. You can use them for a lot of different things because you can switch the polar patterns on them. Those microphones specifically also have a high pass filter that you can change from, I believe, 40, 60, 80, and then also a decibel decrease too. So like if you're using them and the sound source is like really loud and you want to do like a 20 dB decrease, you can just push a button and it does that automatically. Great microphones. There's AKG makes a similar version of that microphone called the C214, which is a more affordable version. You just don't get the multiple polar pattern switch on that microphone. Let's move to small diaphragm condensers. Thin cardioid mics, sometimes called pencil condensers, they're really good for picking up more high-end frequencies because the diaphragm is smaller. It's gonna capture those like crispy transients. So we're thinking like cymbals, you know, the attack on the cymbals, the kind of shimmer that high-end frequencies have. It's also really good for like any sort of percussion instrument. They work really good as like a drum overhead pair. Typically, when you're using pencil condensers, I like to use them as a stereo pair because it gives you this sort of image of the stereo realm. Sometimes when recording an acoustic guitar, I'll combine a large diaphragm and a small diaphragm condenser microphone because the small diaphragm condenser microphone can pick up those like the sound of like the brightness of the strings more than a large diaphragm condenser would. So the next one is ribbon mics. So ribbon mics are it's kind of like the old microphone technology. They were used in a lot of like radio broadcasting when microphones were first being developed. I kind of like to think of them as like kind of the grandma microphone because they're like the oldest microphone, and they just sound really warm and smooth. They're really great for vocals, capturing vocals and recording. I wouldn't use ribbon mics in live setting for vocals unless you're recording like a folk instrumentalist or amplifying a folk instrumentalist playing acoustic guitar and singing. A single ribbon mic would be great for that sort of application. So how do they work? It's the same electromagnetic principle as a dynamic mic, but it's a very delicate strip of corrugated aluminum or film or gold instead of a moving foil. So the diaphragm is basically just like a strip of some sort of metal and is able to pick up sound pressure from both sides. I really like using ribbons as drum overhead mics too, because they capture a lot of those transients, but they also sound kind of warm and give a good character to the overall drum sound. They're extremely sensitive to the velocity of air, so real subtle movements can be picked up on ribbon microphones. Like if you're using them to record vocals, you're going to hear a lot of the plosives happen. If someone's saying, puh, like that sort of sound, you're going to hear that more. And like, you want to throw a pop filter in front of that so it kind of cancels out those plosives. The output from ribbon mics is generally pretty low. More modern ribbon microphones also have like a preamp kind of built into them to amplify the output. Those are called active ribbon mics and need phantom power. Old ribbon mics, if you send phantom power to them, it's going to destroy them because it's just going to break the diaphragm on it. But most modern ribbon mics have like a protector on them, so if you accidentally send phantom power to them, it's going to be fine. Yeah, just don't try it, unless it's an active ribbon mic.
And the price of a ribbon mic.
Yeah, so they're pretty expensive microphones. There was a somewhat local to the Pacific Northwest company that was making really good ribbon mics called Fathead microphones. They were out of Washington. They released the Cascade and the Cascade 2. Great microphones. The owner of the company passed, and now it's rebranded to Pinnacle microphones. So if you're looking for a good ribbon mic that you can kind of source from the area, I'd recommend the company Pinnacle. Like I said, they're the warmest and they're the most natural sounding of all type of microphones. That's why I really like to use them on voice in recording application. They tend to capture instruments close to how you would actually hear them. A wide and flat frequency response, starting very low, and then naturally tapering off in the highs. So I like to think of them as like the closest microphone to our ears because there's a diaphragm on both. The diaphragm picks up sound pressure from both sides of the microphone, and you can get kind of really creative with like mic placement with that sort of setting, where I'll get into polar patterns, but they pick up as a figure 8 polar pattern. If you place them like this, you're going to pick up sound from here and here, or you can place them like this and you're going to pick up sound from here, but then also whatever's hitting the diaphragm and moving past it. If you don't own a ribbon mic, buy a ribbon mic. Let's go into the different polar patterns. This diagram has 6 different polar patterns. Most microphones that you buy are going to show the specific microphone's polar pattern and frequency response. I'm just going to kind of go over the top 3 that we see here because these are just variations of that top right polar pattern. Where we're looking at like where the sound source is hitting the diaphragm from. There are some microphones that pick up kind of in a spherical polar pattern area. those are going to be like more expensive vocal mics that you would use for like live on stage. But yeah, we're looking at where the diaphragm is and how the sound is hitting that diaphragm. So omnidirectional microphones, these work on the pressure principle. They're single-sided diaphragm, and what the pressure principle means is like how sound pressure is hitting the diaphragm. They're sensitive to sound in all directions, resistant to vocal plosives. So like a lot of lav mics, a lot of high-end lav mics are omnidirectional microphones, because that's the main thing they're capturing is someone talking. There's no proximity effect to these microphones. So imagine, I actually saw a good example of what a microphone proximity effect is on Instagram the other day, where they had the microphone in the center and a little train going around it, making a sound. So imagine this microphone is in the center and a train is moving around it. It's gonna sound the same as it's continuing around the microphone. There's not gonna be any sort of proximity effect to it. They have pretty low gain before feedback, so you're gonna see these microphones more in studio application than a live application. They also add like the least coloration to the sound, so it's not gonna make it any more bright or dark. It's gonna give like a really good natural sound, so close to what you're hearing is happening. Next, we got our bidirectional or figure 8 polar pattern. Like I mentioned earlier, ribbon microphones naturally have this because of the way the microphone is designed. They also, it works on the pressure gradient principle. It's a single diaphragm receiving pressure from both sides. They're equally sensitive to the sound from the front and the back because of that. We have our null points or sound, or the points of the polar pattern where we're gonna lose sound is at 90 degrees and 270 degrees. They're really sensitive to vocal plosives, like I mentioned earlier, because they're gonna capture that kind of like low attack in the voice when you make any sort of word that has a plosive. They have the highest proximity effect. So imagine the train scenario again. You have your ribbon mic here and the train's going around. You know, you're going to hear it really well here and here, but then it's going to die out here and here because the diaphragm's not picking up the sides. It requires a side address microphone placement, which means like kind of disregard that, because you can use these microphones, like you can kind of use that proximity effect to your advantage. How I have my mics set up in my home studio right now for the overheads, I'm actually using 3 overhead mics, and I positioned my ribbon mics kind of like this, so I capture that stereo field of the drum set. So I'm kind of using that figure 8 pattern to my advantage for that, and then I put a large diaphragm condenser right in the center, and that's just kind of capturing like the overall spread, and it gives a really good like stereo image to the overhead mics of the drum set. This is your standard pattern for pretty much all ribbon mics. So next up is cardioid mic. This is gonna be, yeah, go ahead.
Just to make these diagrams a little easier to understand, can you indicate where the microphone is and how it's oriented, meaning?
Yeah, let me grab a microphone actually. So here's your dynamic microphone. Everyone recognizes this. This is a SM58. So the diaphragm is laying flat directly here. So the cardioid pattern of this microphone is going to encompass that area. So we're looking at like, we're looking at that basically. Cardioid mics, they also work on the pressure gradient principle. The diaphragm receives pressure from both sides, and then the rear of the diaphragm is actually surrounded by this sort of like acoustic labyrinth, finely tuned to decrease amplitude on the rear side of the diaphragm. The cardioid polar pattern is the most common polar pattern. It's very good for vocal microphones, both live and recording. If you're working on a budget in the studio, and you can only afford like dynamic microphones, you can actually use multiple dynamic microphone placements to achieve the different polar patterns by, you set one dynamic like this and you set one dynamic like that, you're achieving that figure 8 polar pattern. So there's kind of tricks you can use just with these microphones to achieve the same thing. They're most sensitive to sound in a single direction, so directly in front. That's why if you're running board, and your vocalist is singing like this, it's like, hey, get your mic up in front of your face, because that's how it works, because if they're like this, it's not really going to capture, what the voice sounds like. The null point is at the rear of the diaphragm at 180 degrees. So there's a lot of gain before feedback on these microphones, which makes them great for live. And then you get roughly 6 decibel decrease on the 90 and 270 axis. So kind of like here and here. And that's why like you don't want a vocalist to be singing like this, because you get that kind of gain, you get that dB decrease at this angle, whereas like this, you're going to hear the full volume of the sound. They are sensitive to vocal plosives. Most standard dynamic microphones are going to have like a windscreen built into them. So this one, it's got this windscreen before the diaphragm, and then there's also like some foam padding in here. So that's going to eliminate like all of the plosive sounds that you would hear from just having like a bare diaphragm. They exhibit a pretty decent proximity effect. You don't want to sing like this because you're not really going to hear anything. And then if you imagine like kind of the train example that I was talking about before, but it's like going like this, you're going to hear this oscillation of like loud sound, quiet sound. They are a 1-to-1 ratio of omnidirectional and a bidirectional polar pattern. And what that means is the omnidirectional polar pattern is, imagine that as like basically a full sphere that the diaphragm's able to receive sound from. And then the figure 8 polar pattern, if those two were placed on top of each other, like this would be the ratio of that. So I know Chris kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I thought it'd be good to go over it also. Here's just kind of a basic chart of how signal flow works. You have your mic or your line input, and then next is your input gain. That's going to come from your preamps. Past that, you have your filters like EQ or whatever other effect you're going to be using. After that, it goes to your fader. If you have stuff set to pre-fader, that's how you can control your aux and your FX sends, and then your aux outputs. But then on your aux outputs, you can have different effects, aux returns, return to the master gain, and then your fader. After your fader is your pan, your left-right pan, and then that's going to your master volume, to your main outputs and your monitor outputs or sub outputs. It's real important to understand signal flow in either a live or recording environment, and just knowing how, like, what's coming from upstream and how it's getting to the sound source, the speaker. Talk about gain staging a little bit. So what it is, again, it's the process of managing the levels of audio signal at each stage in the audio signal path to achieve optimal sound quality without distortion. These are some kind of key points to gain staging: noise, so any unwanted sound in the signal, which can be amplified at each gain stage. If you have a really noisy guitar, electric guitar, that's pushing out a lot of noise, you're not going to want to. You're going to want to try and eliminate that without pushing too much gain. So then you're hearing a lot of noise. The noise floor, that's the level in a gain stage where the noise is louder than the signal. And then, like Chris mentioned, distortion happens when signal overloads a gain stage, leading to clipping and distortion. Headroom is the amount of like level you have between a nominal operating level and where it's clipping. This helps prevent sudden peaks for causing distortion. So if you give yourself a good amount of headroom, even when you tell like your drummer, hey, smack your snare as loud as you can, you don't want it to push it to the top. You want to have like a little bit of room so that like if he does hit louder, it's not going to distort it. And then unity gain is when a gain stage neither boosts nor cuts the incoming signal, affecting it as little as possible. That kind of, you want to have like, if you're sending all of your drum inputs to DCA, you want to find where the unity gain of that is going to be without like pushing all the signal over the top. I kind of think of this as like, it's almost like a bowl with water in it. You want the water to be like at a good level so that like, this is a weird example, I don't know why this is coming to my head, but if a dog is trying to drink it, they're not like reaching super low to it, but then also if it's at the top, the dog's gonna be drinking it, it's gonna be spilling all over the place. So that's kind of the end of my talk about microphones and stuff, and then I wanted to kind of give some application to that with a drum kit. Drum kits, in my experience, it's the hardest to get to sound good. I was lucky enough to have a brother that was a drummer in my punk rock band in high school. And then my college roommate, who was also a music major with me, was a drummer. And he was a very hard hitter. And we played in a funk band together. My brother was a really hard hitter too, which taught me to play drums dynamically. So both of them, my brother and my old college roommate, were very picky on how they wanted their drum sounding in recordings. And also, they were just, the point I'm getting to is it made me pretty good at miking up a drum set and recording it for a live setting. So I'm gonna move my way over here, and then Chris, if you wanna help me out with this. So the mic setup on this kit, I used 11 microphones. All of them are dynamic microphones, except for the 2 overhead mics. One thing real quick too, let me step in here. So one of the trickiest things to do is to get a good overhead mic placement. So maybe a lot of you know this, but this is kind of my trick for doing that, is I kind of go 2 to 3, sorry. So I kind of go about 2 to 3 feet above the direct center of the snare. And then that's where the first diaphragm is going to be placed on this mic. And then to eliminate phasing, kind of just push this over here where you want to capture your rides and your low toms. And then, so this one needs to kind of come down like that. So,
and that has to do with time arrival.
Yeah, so what that is eliminating is phase from the snare drum. So when you're hitting the snare drum, the sound's going up to this one, but if this is further away in distance, you're gonna hear this like, the snare drum's gonna get to this mic first and then to this one second. So you wanna make sure that those are the same, equidistant from the center of the snare drum. There's a ton of different techniques for miking up a drum set. This is kind of like the over-the-top setup where there's a kick in, a kick out, snare top, snare bottom, a hi-hat. Each tom has its own microphone, 2 overheads, and then I also placed this microphone here. I like to call this the knee mic, and it's basically just pointed right at the drummer's knee. That kind of, I like doing this for live because it adds more attack to the kick drum. And this setup, how we have the microphones over here and the speakers over here, is not how you want to do it. But that's just how we have it set up for the room today. So let's kind of hear, and then you can see on here, you can't really tell, but I have it laid out so it's in order, kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom, hi-hat, tom, 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 overhead, left, right, and then I dumped my knee microphone kind of at the very end. So,
What are you trying to achieve with the knee mic?
so what I've found is it just kind of is a good blending microphone. It picks up a lot of the attack on the kick drum beater. It also kind of gets a little bit of the snare and then kind of some of those like lower pushing transients of the cymbals. Yeah, and the toms. I started doing that after, I'm also a drummer, and I started doing that after I played a gig and the sound guy put that microphone there. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Like I want to hear what that sounds like. It's just kind of a good like blending microphone. But like I also said, this isn't the ideal sort of like sound setup here. But yeah, if you want to give like some kick, Chris. So what for the kick drum, the in mic, so like right now we're just hearing the in. That's going to have a lot more attack, and I kind of place it like directly below the beater, and then kind of maybe 6 inches back from the front of the drum head. And then I'll turn on the kick out microphone, and then that mic kind of gives it more body. You're gonna hear like the lower ends on that. So now let's go to the snare. So what the top of I have the top snare mic on right now. That's gonna pick up all the attack and like the sustain of the snare, and then when you add the bottom snare mic in, you're picking up the snares resonating off the bottom of the head. I find it good to go ahead and stop for a second. I find it good to line those up. Like if this is where your snares are at on the bottom of the drum, I like putting the top mic kind of in line with that, with the bottom mic, so that it captures a good clean sound from both the top and the bottom of the snare head. Hi-hat mic isn't always necessary, but if you want to hear more, like if your drum's behind a cage and you kind of want to hear more of the attack on the hi-hats, it's a good thing to add in. The mic placement on that, you don't want it to be in between where the hats are closing, because you're going to hear a lot of that air pressure. So kind of putting it up above the hi-hat and angling it down is the way to go. Also having a good distance between the snare and where the hi-hat is, but roughly like 8 inches is good practice. And your drummer's going to change that to whatever they want, but but that's how I like to have it, because then you're not getting as much of the hi-hat into the snare mic.
What about the other way? How do you keep the snare mic, the snare out of the hi-hat mic?
Impossible. A really good gate. Yeah, there's like, I just started using these plugins by Black Slate Audio or Black Salt. Black Salt Audio. Yeah, it's called a silencer. It's like magic. I kept seeing all these videos of these producers using it and just going like, oh wow, this is amazing. This is so good. And I'm like, yeah, right. And then I tried it and I was literally jaw dropped, like, I can't believe this. But yeah, working with a gate, so that like you're kind of cutting out the heavy attack on the snare. You're gonna get some bleed. Yeah, how about for now, let's hear just like kind of like a kick snare hi-hat thing. Okay, cool. The kick in and kick out mics, I kind of like to put like a little high pass filter on it and then boost the low range from maybe like 60 to 100, and then kind of duck out where like from like 150 to 200, and that kind of just gives it a nice little push over the top. But it's all of this is it's really dependent on a handful of things: your drummer, the room, and what type of PA you're using. It's really good to know, like our roster of drummers here, I know which ones are going to be like the real heavy hitters. And so I'm going to want to gate the snare more or the toms more than some of the other drummers. So kind of knowing who your drummers are and what they sound like is really important. But then also the room that you're mixing in. If you're able to hear a lot of the drums already in the room, you don't want to like full blast the drums into the PA also. Maybe blend in some of the overheads in the snare and the kick to kind of give it that nice little push. Let's go to the toms and just kind of give me like a 1, 2, 3. So right now I have just the tom mics kind of going. And for each one, depending on how the tom mic is tuned, finding where the frequency is on the tom in the low end, you could kind of see here, it's like I kind of have that pushed up a little bit for each tom, but it's positioned where the frequency of the tom is happening, and then kind of doing an immediate cut after that that's what I like to do. And I mean, these aren't rules that you need to follow. This is just kind of what I've learned works best for me and my ears and what I like the sound to do. So now I'm going to turn all of those off and just turn the overheads on. So if you want to kind of give me like a little shuffle, like with the ride cymbal, like a shuffle beat. Yeah. So the overhead microphones are mostly, you're using that to pick up a lot of the cymbals, but it's going to capture everything on the drum set, even the kick. So for my frequency EQing, I'll do a pretty heavy high pass filter to kind of cut out those lower frequencies, and then just give it like a little lift on the high end. I found that if you do a cut right around like 2000 or 22 kilohertz, it'll kind of back out the attack of the snare in the overheads. So now I'll turn those off, and then this one, go ahead and stop. So this one I kind of just added in for fun. This is the knee mic that I mentioned. If you hit the kick drum, so I kind of have it pushed pretty hard right now. It's also very low gain. So you hear how that's like, it's capturing a lot of the attack of the beater. And then this is with like the 2 kick mics in also. And then I'll drop the knee mic out. And then some of the attack goes away with that. So like I said, it's kind of just for fun, like a blending mic. There's a lot of different miking techniques, like I mentioned. Like, you can do a simple setup as just like a kick, snare, and 2 overheads in an XY position. So it's capturing like a stereo field of the drums. There's also, I'm blanking on his name, Glenn John's method, where he uses 2 ribbons and a kick. And the ribbons are positioned, so one of them's capturing more of the snare, hi-hat side of the kit. The other one's capturing more of the toms, kind of ride side of the kit. That's just the real basic kind of fundamentals of doing this. You're going to learn your most by actually doing it and mixing a drum kit or recording a drum kit. For funsies, let's just have kind of all of them on for a minute and just,
I have a question.
yeah.
Can you talk through advantages and disadvantages to a drum cage or shield?
Yeah, so the shield on stage, in most church applications, that's going to give you more control of like what the drums are going to sound like through your system. It's going to eliminate a lot of these sort of like high frequency ringing sounds that are coming off of the cymbals and the snares, because that's being blocked by the shield. You can also get like cymbal only shields that you kind of place strategically so that those high frequencies aren't going to like cut out super hard in the kit, and you'll have more control over your mix. Most live band applications, the drummer's not going to haul in a big shield. So you kind of need to work with what the room is and what your application is for the sound. Like if you're mixing for a jazz band, for instance, the drummer's going to play a lot softer than a rock and roll band, and you can use that to your advantage. If the drummer's a really hard hitter, you don't need to put a ton of mics on the drum kit because you're going to hear it anyways. So it really just depends on the setting you're in, the room you're in, and who the drummer is.
Have you found a lot of success using like a E8010 or some of those kind of like units that are more like taking an analog system and transferring it into a digital system for recording in a live setting?
So I don't do that at all.
Okay.
There's a lot of people that will, in recording also, they'll like, kind of mix sampled drums in with their real drums. I'm just not one of those people. Like, I like to capture.
I'm going to show an example of that.
Oh, cool. Okay. I like to.
You triggered, right, stuff, and so you'll probably talk about that.
Yeah,
a
I've
little
got that.
bit.
Yeah. So Ben will talk about that a little more. I personally just don't like doing that. I like the raw sound of the natural drums. So.
What mic are you running for the knee mic?
Right now it's just a Audix i5. Any sort of, like a SM57 is really cool. Any sort of dynamic mic is kind of the key for that microphone because you're going to be able to give it a lot more gain before feedback. Also, the cardioid polar pattern is kind of what I want in that placement. If you were to put a condenser mic in that placement, you're going to hear a lot more of those like high frequency transients and stuff coming from the snare and the hi-hat. So using a dynamic with a cardioid pattern is ideal for that one.
And I'm assuming that's a bad idea if your drummer's had a cheesy bean burrito.
Probably, yeah. Yeah.
How do you prevent, in many cases, on stages, you have a singer in front of the drummer, and the drum noise, the drum sound gets into the singer's vocal microphone.
Yeah, so that's a matter of like positioning where your vocalist is going to be, kind of being strategic about, okay, I don't want to. A couple weeks ago, we had a violinist play on a Sunday here, and we kind of set up this stage layout where we have our band more in a pocket, drums, electric guitar, bass. But I was like, no way I'm putting the violin there because he doesn't have a pickup, and I'm throwing a condenser mic on him. So I kind of repositioned him like to the other side of the stage. If you're working with a smaller stage and that's hard to do, or hard to avoid drum bleed into the vocal microphone, you can add in, there's certain filters that you can use that'll work really well for that. If you're using just the internal programming of your mixer, some like gates can kind of do that, but you don't want it to be like too heavy because then you're cutting out some of the vocals that are happening. So that really, like, I would start with the source on that and position well so that the vocalist isn't directly in front of the drum kit, or move you know, you can also move your whole drum kit to an area that's going to make it easier so that there's no bleed going into the vocalist. Like if your drums are kind of center backline, it's going to get into all the vocalists. But if you position it over to the side, that's going to help with that, and then you can have your vocalist further away from that.
And using the polar pattern of the mic to help you with that, right? So if you turn them a little bit, you can sometimes do that.
Exactly. You know, I'm a big fan of like working with what you got and getting it to work really well. Understanding how mic polar patterns work and their null points can really help with that too. Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed talking about all this stuff and hope you learned something.